back to the I'm F.I.N.E podcast. I'm here with Danny Sud, a registered nurse with CMHA, specifically working in opioids and addiction. And in this section of the show, I would really like to talk with Danny about reframing substance abuse disorder. Because, I think a lot of people will still call it addiction. It is an addiction, but that's not really speaking to the problem. So let's talk about how do we reframe this whole idea around addiction.
So, this is a really good point. And I think it takes me back to, when I was in nursing school and what really influenced me to go into mental health and addictions. Prior to beginning nursing school, and I went to the University of Toronto, I had a very limited, if none at all, understanding of addictions and mental health issue. It was not on my radar. And I moved to Toronto to begin nursing school in 2005. And as you do when you move to any new city, you make friends. Mm-hmm. And I noticed a lot of the people I made friends with, I came to learn were struggling with an addiction-related issue. And at that time in 2005, crystal meth was the big thing in Toronto, right? Particularly certain communities. And I would see people just like me, no different than me, right? School, working, etc., struggling. And I didn't understand it because, again, I had this preconceived notion that probably came, again, through movies and, a lot of a lot of the images that we're exposed to, that, an addiction affects a specific population. Right, it affects individuals that may be experiencing poverty or problems with the criminal justice system or housing. There's no way it's going to happen to a working professional, right, or a student or anything like that. But all of a sudden, I started seeing my peer group struggling, and I had no idea why. I couldn't make sense of it. And interestingly enough, I was walking home after school one day, and I saw a poster taped to a street post. And it said that, tonight, or, on that particular night, the Toronto Crystal Meth Task Force was having a town hall. And they were giving out free pizza. So, as a student, I'm like, free pizza. And I lived close to where the venue was. So I decided, I'm going to go check it out. So I went. And at this town hall, they had community representatives, but they also had representatives from CMHA, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. They had people from their withdrawal management program and their sort of addiction medicine service at large. And I sat there for about 2 hours, and it literally felt like 2 minutes, mesmerized with everything that they had to say. And coming out of that meeting, I recognized that, first of all, an addiction is not some moral shortcoming. It's not some weakness or character flaw. Individuals simply cannot just stop, right? You just can't say, why don't you pull your boots up and stop? Right. That's not how it works, right? I also walked away recognizing that an addiction and a mental health issue are larger health issues, right? That they're actually recognized health issues, just like diabetes, heart disease, a broken arm. These are health issues. These are, in very many ways, deserving of treatment as anything else that's, health related. And it was at that moment I recognized that when I graduate, this is what I want to do, right? This is what excites me. It excited me when I graduated in 2007, and here we are in 2023, and it still excites me. I'm still passionate about it. And I think, there was in 2007, and it still exists in 2023, so much stigma. Yeah. And so much misunderstanding. And a large part of my role at CMHA is to do a lot of community education to build an awareness around what an addiction is, right? And why individuals, can't just stop. And, I work with a lot of family members, right? Spouses, parents, etc. And oftentimes they go to their significant others and they say, why can't you just stop? Yeah. Right? You're selfish. Yeah. You're only thinking of yourself. Right? Or they have a period of abstinence and then they have a slip or a relapse. and they get told you're selfish, you're only thinking of yourself. And in actuality, the rates of relapses are on par with the relapse of other chronic health issues, right? So I work with them to recognize, and begin to shift the conversation. So they look at it, through a health perspective. And I think by looking at it through a health perspective, not only do we start, having positive conversations, we also prevent people from having accidental overdoses, right? Because they can begin to have conversations with their significant others about naloxone. Perhaps saying, hey, mom, or hey, spouse, I'm struggling. In the event that I have any of these signs and symptoms, I'd like you to have a naloxone kit. And this is how you can use it. Because, naloxone saves lives. And the more we begin to address stigma, the more we're saving lives, right? Because, people all of a sudden are able to talk about it in a less judgmental way. But still, a huge percentage of the population don't have access to that information just because, they're not around it, right? And they don't have the benefit of speaking to someone or being exposed to resources, right, to help sort of shift their conversation, which I think, we still need a lot more of.
Yeah, and it's all of that is really interesting. I mean, myself, guilty as charged growing up, and you hear it from other generations, and it becomes a very toxic norm almost of speaking about it. And really the main reason why I wanted you to come in and why I knew this discussion about addiction is really important is I did another show and we had a guest in, and they actually live in Halton Hills. Forgive me, I forget their names. So if they hear this, please forgive me. But it was a fascinating conversation that the host at the time had with this mother of a son who has substance abuse disorder. And she's really advocating very strongly to change the language around it. But she told very honestly and very genuinely her story about dealing with her son and his addictions. And she said, I was guilty as anybody else of trying to force him to stop. And then what came of that is it forced him more towards the addiction and into dangerous places. And she realized pretty quickly that the support he needed was the acceptance that this was something that he was struggling with. It seems counterintuitive to lean into it rather than to try to force them away from it. But all too often, she was saying it just forces them more heavily into the addiction. Then the mental health side of it comes into that they're disappointing you, and then they start. It's almost like a self-harm type thing. So she leaned into it and found that if she accepted him for who he was now, and not, she was very careful to say that she put up boundaries as to what she had a discussion with her son as to like what is acceptable within the house. So if you're going to be trying to take money from me, that's unacceptable. That's a boundary, right? But I'm here. I have a naloxone kit. I don't want you doing this in an alley somewhere or in some rundown home somewhere. At least here it's in control. And the relationship is better. And he still uses, but even his mental health around his use of whatever it is better. He has a better frame of mind and a better understanding of what he's doing, why he's doing it, and then it's not necessarily something he should be ashamed of. And I mean, when they were here, I think he had been sober for at that point for a period of time, and hopefully he still is. But it's a real journey for those folks. It's a real process, and that's the really difficult thing, is to get people to understand that the substance use is a symptom of something else.
Yeah. So, with a lot of the families, significant others, spouses, parents that I work with, they do exactly what you described, right? They try to support their son, daughter, whomever, in a way that's counterproductive, right? They try to cure them in many ways. And sort of a mantra I like to use when I'm working with significant others or family members is the 3 C's, the 3 C's of an addiction, right? You didn't cause it, you cannot control it, and you cannot cure it. And almost every parent or loved one that I have worked with, initially, they're trying to do all three, right? So at their own expense, they're neglecting their self-care, they're isolating from their lives, and they are now just consumed with and caught up with curing their loved one or controlling their loved one's lives. And again, I encourage them, and it's very, very difficult for some individuals to hear, to pull back, right? And focus on your own needs. And when you're ready to lean into your loved one, let that begin to shape some of the limits and some of the boundaries. So, I love you, and you cannot steal money from my purse. I love you, and these are my ground rules. Right? And beginning to shift or sort of pivot in that direction can be huge for some individuals, right? Because it begins to open up dialogue, right? What does support look like? What does change look like? I also encourage significant others to, ask their loved one, how can I support you? And give them the opportunity to tell you what their needs are. Because again, oftentimes, as a family member, you're like, you need to do this, this, and this, and this. But instead, give them the opportunity. What do you need right now? And again, like you sort of touched upon, some individuals may be struggling with an underlying mental health issue. So for example, if you're someone who's generally depressed, right? Someone who experiences low mood, perhaps anxiety, there may be a certain appeal to using substances. For instance, if I am struggling with depression and I use opioids or I use alcohol, all of a sudden I feel, quote, normal. I can go to that party. I can go out for dinner. I can go mow the lawn, right? So you've now found something that is treating an underlying mental health issue. Similarly, if you're someone that's always very elevated, very high energy, and you notice, hey, when I consume alcohol or, any other, a benzodiazepine, for instance, all of a sudden I'm calmer, right? I'm more relaxed. It sort of brings me down. There's going to be an appeal to that. If you've experienced some trauma in your past, and trauma is very unique to the individual, but what we find is with a lot of individuals, they may have experienced past trauma, whether it was a personal trauma or a professional trauma, they carry that with them. And they find, wait a minute, when I drink, when I use this opioid or take this pill, I could forget about that momentarily. Right? I could forget about that traumatic experience. And again, some people, with schizophrenia, right, or other forms of thought disorder, when I use, the voices go away. Right? So there are so many different reasons why individuals use. And oftentimes, someone with a substance use disorder will be referred to a psychiatrist. It's very difficult for a psychiatrist to make an accurate diagnosis while the person is still actively using. Because in those cases, we don't know, is their behavior a result of their substance use, or is it indicative of something underlying? So again, a psychiatrist may, in many instances, say, okay, you know what, I'm here to support you. I've done my assessment. I encourage you to be abstinent for, say, X amount of time. And when you're abstinent for X amount of time, I'm better able to ascertain what's going on, to see, was this substance-induced or is this organic? And if they can figure that out, they could put appropriate treatments in place, which is an example of where CMHA would come in, for instance, right? So, if we've got a new referral and, we are working closely with a psychiatrist and someone is struggling with an addiction and perhaps a mental health issue, and they need to be abstinent, say for 6 weeks, right? We'll help support them to achieve that goal so that they are able to have a more fruitful psychiatric assessment, right? But again, being abstinent from a substance that you've been using for years, for 6 weeks, is so difficult. And it's difficult, again, because of the impact that these substances have on your brain,
Yeah.
right? Because, again, it's not a matter of, just stop, you should be good, right? There's a biological basis, a medical basis, right? So stopping needs to be done in some cases under medical supervision or with medical support. Right? Because these substances, alcohol, opioids, etc., they really change a lot of your neurophysiology.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't really 100% understand that. And the other issue, like you were talking about, and I think it's important to reinforce, and this was reinforced from another person who was on a show that I was working on, and they had come down from let's just say Northern Ontario, very Northern Ontario, but they came down here specifically because they were talking about depression, mostly focusing in men and how suicide rates are much higher in men with depression, but it also touched on substance abuse. And he was saying this isn't an issue of, like, too often we focus on when somebody is using something abusively, that we're focusing on, well, they're doing it to get high. They're doing it for the high. Well, they're doing it for the high because this is an issue of pain. They're these people who are using, they're in pain.
Yes.
And you touched on it, where it stops the voices in my head. It stops me from feeling abnormal. This helps me to feel balanced, right? Those are all admissions of pain. These people are suffering. And worse, they're suffering in silence because they feel they've gone to the extreme of, I'm going to do this. And I think that's really, really important to note. Now, on that note, we're going to take one more break, and then we're going to talk specifically about opioids, because, like it or lump it, we're in a crisis. Opioid use is everywhere. It's in the street drugs. As a parent, it's something, my kids are now moving into their teenage years. I am terrified of this. But more specifically, I spoke with we were talking earlier, I spoke with a doctor who in his free time is also a coroner, I don't want to say freelance, but he does this on call, and he said most of his calls are on opioid overdoses. Most of his calls to come and identify a body or to ascertain what has happened, it comes down to opioid overdoses, which is really terrifying. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the opioid crisis and hopefully unpack a little bit as to maybe even how we got here, and what's being done.